my name is Adam Smith, and today we continue the Kickstarter preview series for Dying Light the board game coming from Glass Cannon Unplugged. As of February 27th, it'll be landing on Kickstarter, and you can find the campaign link in the pinned comment and video description. We're going to pick things up exactly where we left it off in the last video. If you haven't checked out the how to set up video or the prototype unboxing, I'll put a link to the entire series up in the top right hand corner. All of this in an effort to help you make an informed decision as to whether or not Dying Light is for you. Without further ado, let's begin gameplay together, but first just a couple quick mentions around the setup. The one thing I changed is instead of the exposure decks having the moon at the very top of the card, I rotated them so the day symbol is at the very top because we start on day number 7, which is during the day. When we move from round 7 to round 8, we'll transition from day to night. At that point in time, I'll show you how this all changes. So basically just a rotation of the deck here to get things going. And the other thing I wanted to mention was around one of the equipment pieces that Rowan was carrying was not on its correct side. To ensure it's on the right side, make sure you see that yellow box in the bottom left hand corner. That's letting you know you have a passive ability that you can use potentially off of the equipment. Now, just to tie in what I mentioned moments ago around starting on round number 7, that's just because this scenario specifically states to start at number 7. You may have scenarios inside the final box that actually have you starting at the very beginning of the round track, but as you can see, the beginning portions are all day focused, and then once you transition from 7 to 8, you get into night, and there's a day and night mode inside this game. I'll explain the differences as we go through, because we get to go through one full round as a day phase, and then we're going to go through multiple rounds night. Escaping the junkyard. You there, I don't know which hole you crawled out of, but you sure got in over your heads. That gate that just closed behind you, it ain't opening anytime soon. There's a nest right next to you, and it's almost dawn. Do the math. Do what I say though, and you might just make it. The fence is live. There's 2 switches southeast and northwest of your location. Flip them to kill it, and you can go out the northern gate. Now tell me you copy all that, stay on the channel, and go. Now let's focus on the bottom half of the card. We have some bolded items here to talk about. The first one is the fence cannot be climbed or jumped over. I mean, this is Dying Light. Parkour is part of the experience, but you cannot jump over or climb over the fence at this point, being that it is live. Second thing is you have to interact with the 2 switches, both labeled number 1 on tokens, to open up the gate. That's our primary objective there. And the next one says once a runner, of course, interacts with the last switch, you remove the gate and you're going to reveal card S2, which is the one right to the left of it. The fence no longer has the movement restrictions, so you can start climbing it and scaling over it. So our 2 characters, Rowan and Prescott, are going to be starting in this location right here. We have a number of biters all the way around. If you're wondering what this token is right here, it is a spawn point. We have some fire over here. We have the switches marked 1 and 1. These are 2 locations we need to interact with those tokens. Once we do this, we're going to open up the northern gate, which is right here. Now in the final version, it'll actually be one of those walls will be a gate. It'll look like an actual gate. It shows it even inside the prototype rules, but in this prototype, the walls are walls. But basically this will be removed and you'll have access to this other area here behind, which is pretty awesome. Down here we also have an item, a common item that we can potentially pick up. Now let's get familiar with our characters that we've chosen. I've got Prescott here to start. He gets an air kick. You know this, when you actually flip the card over to the opposite side, it will tell you exactly what skill card you're going to get. And as you progress through the final version of the game, you'll be able to acquire different skill cards and actually select certain ones. You're just given one out of the gates here. And you also have a narrative here to read for Prescott. It states, you mess with what's mine, and it's me you're cruising for. I'm the one everybody turns to when things start going south, which is pretty much the norm now. Talk strategy all you want, but point me towards the thick of it, and you got my word, I'll leave a lasting impression. My steel does most of the talking, and it's sure got a lot to say. When we set up the characters in the prior video, I chose a raggedy chopper here. You'll have a number of starting items you can select from in the final version. This is the one I selected from in the prototype here. It has the ability to use a fast attack, or you can do a chop suey, which also has a cleave 1 attached to it. We'll talk more about how all this works later on. We also have all our equipment. My second character is Rowan. She's coming in with a cricket stick, and as you can see, has a fast attack, also has a crickety crack, which allows for a knockdown of 1 enemy, which is very nice. She also comes along with a perfect dodge based on the back of her card. There is a die on the back of both of these cards, but it's not included as part of the prototype, but certainly will be a thing in the final version. And you can also go ahead and read, if you wish, the backstory on her as well. Let's go ahead and find out the win and loss conditions and dig in. To win the game, you got to meet the final objective of the scenario. You do so by gradually exploring the game world and visiting various points of interest that will be placed around the map by a deck of narrative scenario cards. And we actually read the very top one and have an idea of exactly what we need to do inside of this section of the game board. Now, we lose the game immediately when one of the player characters gets eliminated. The second that happens, we're gone. And that means 4 face-up wound cards. We get 4 face-up wound cards, that character's taken out, and the scenario is a loss. Now, another thing to keep in mind is that certain scenarios are going to have a time element involved, and if it comes into play, that's another way that you can lose the game, is if time runs out. Dying Light's round structure as you go through gameplay is broken into 3 phases. You have the activation phase, the exposure phase, and then the end phase. Then you'll wrap right back around to activation and begin another round. We start off in the activation phase. We go down one of 2 paths dependent on whether it's day or night. As of right now, it is day. So in this case, we get to choose between all the characters we're controlling who goes first. And once that character is activated, they'll go through the entire turn. And then another character can be activated after that. Once all of the characters have been activated, then we're going to move to the exposure phase. Now, as you'll see, when we get into round number 2, which is going to be round 8 inside of this scenario, when we transition from day to night, the activation phase is going to shift. Things will be handled differently, and you're going to see the night phase really coming into play and shifting the way things act and react throughout the entire gameplay experience, and it's a really cool aspect of this one. This round we're in the daylight, so I get to choose which character to activate. I'm choosing Prescott, and as this is the very first round, things are quite easy to grab the dice. You're simply going to grab all the dice except for the yellow momentum dice, and you're going to roll all of them. We'll talk a little bit later about how we can earn the momentum die. You don't get this off the hop. We're going to go ahead and roll the dice we do have, though, and see what we get. What's rolled here is considered your action dice pool. You're going to use dice in order to do actions, and you can actually pair the dice up to match for their bonuses to give you an advantage when you do specific actions if you wish, but you can also use any colored die for any actions. You're not restricted there. There's lots of freedom. The reference card that was included as part of the prototype does a pretty good job of summing up all the different character actions. There are a couple extra things to add to each of these, and I'll discuss them as we actually do them. But at a high level, you can move, climb, jump, attack, defend, and interact. The first action I want to do is to climb. Prescott wants to get on top of this building and maybe make his way over and potentially grab this and maybe kind of skirt around this side to get to that switch. We'll send him that way, and maybe we'll send her around this way, heading over to that switch. We'll kind of send them off in 2 different directions and see if that pans out. So what I'm going to do here is a climb right at the gates. When you do a climb, you always have to spend a die. So again, doesn't matter which one it is. Don't worry about the actual icons on the die when you're trying to spend a die to pay for an action. But you do want to take into account the fact that any icons on the die are known as boosters, and those are actually on a reference card up here. And if you happen to use a die that corresponds with an action that the booster can actually help with, then you can make things easier for yourself. So an example would be if I wanted to climb on top of this platform right here, a climb, as it states here off camera, would say to spend 1 die and then 1 additional die for every level you're climbing up. So in this case, to get up here, it would be 2 in order to get up here in terms of the dice I need to spend. That could be any of them. So I could pick these 2 to spend, or I could choose to have a red and a white to spend, and these would go into my dashboard in the furthest left position along the action track. But what I'm going to do instead of using 2 is I'm going to be a little bit smart about this. I'm going to use this blue die because this blue die has a symbol boost on it for climbing. It's a specific advantage for climbing that allows me to reduce the actual climb cost by 1 action die, meaning the climb only costs the 1 die I'm paying. So that's going to be the one I'm going to actually slot into my action track, and we're going to get him up on top. Now looking at the dashboard for Prescott, the die we're using to climb is this one here. When there's no dice in the action track, it goes in the leftmost position. And because this actually has a boost on it for climbing, instead of this action costing me 2 dice to climb up to where I want to go, it's only going to cost me 1 because of being efficient and using this boost on the die as well as the die itself to do the actual climb. So pretty awesome. Now, we're also going to talk really quickly about tempo. Tempo is an indicator of how many actions a runner performs and how smooth smoothly they perform them. If you're familiar with the video game, you'll know that when you start chaining different actions together, you get to a certain point where you have momentum behind you. And so what's going to happen is as you're taking more actions and going up the track with dice, once you get to the 4th position, it is in yellow on purpose, because that means you have done enough actions in sequence to allow you to have the momentum die come into this slot here. Now you don't gain it on the round it gets placed in here, but on a future round, this will become part of your roll in the activation phase, and you'll have it as part of your action dice pool. Now, the thing to make note of with the momentum die is, of course, taking wounds can have you lose the die. If you're not keeping up with the number of actions in the action track, you're not going to be able to keep that momentum die going forward. And also, it's a delicate balance as to whether or not you want to be doing a ton of action dice spending during your turn on your activation, or keeping dice for defense purposes later on. So you may not want to be charging forward and using momentum all the time when you get into situations where defense becomes a primary focus. Now I've set up an example here where I've used 3 action dice to do 3 different actions. Of course, at this point, we've only done 1, but hypothetically, let's say we've done 3 at this point. The tempo die would be the furthest right die, which is this one right here. And if we were told to fatigue a die, this is the die that we would not be able to fatigue. And when you fatigue a die, you can pick another die you have, and it will go into the fatigue area down here. Later on, it will move from the fatigue area to the cooldown area, and then eventually come back around and be able to be rolled and used again in a future action dice pool. One final example around the tempo die. Let's say hypothetically we did this climb and some game effect for some reason told us to take fatigue after we did the climb. Now that's not normal, but let's say it happened. We'd only have 1 die in here, and when we have 1 die, whatever is the furthest right die is known as the tempo die, so this die could not be fatigued down into here. So when you don't have another die to pick from, you have to fatigue one from your active dice pool. For my second action, I'm going to choose to jump. And when you jump, you need to spend 2 dice to pull that off. And there are specific boosters that will actually allow that to be less. If I actually had a booster that had the boots icon on it, I can make that jump just 1 die, very similar to what I did when I climbed. But in this case, I'll have to spend 2, so I'll probably use these 2 blank face ones in order to pay for the jump. And when you jump, you can jump 2 spaces away to an equal level or to a lower level. So you can't jump 2 spaces away and go up a level. You'd have to, if you wanted to try to climb something, well, you have to go over to it and actually climb it. You can't just hop up a building. You don't have that kind of leg power. So we can go ahead and hop over here, no problem. We can also hop over here. Now this goes into a conversation around zones and areas. Now zones are what the characters care about. So zones are going to be basically anything that's segregated in white, regardless of it being dotted or solid. So this is a zone, this is a zone, this is a zone. There's like 3 zones right here. There's 4 zones if you include this one over here with the 1 in it. But for the actual biters, they're looking at things in terms of areas. They don't care about the dotted lines, they care about the solid lines. So this individual, this biter, is actually all in this area. So me hopping over is nice. I get way over top of this individual, but this biter is still going to be in the area and can still be trouble for me when I get in there. Now, on top of the jump costing 2 action dice to do, there is something known as risk. And when you do a jump, you have a base risk of 1. And you actually add a risk for every enemy when you move out of an area. So let's say, hypothetically, we actually had a couple biters on top of this roof and I was trying to jump away. That would increase my risk while doing the jump. In this case, it was pretty clean. It was just 1 risk in order to jump over there. Now, there are ways to mitigate risk because, well, if you don't, you're going to be making a roll that could have some negative effects. So if you want to mitigate it, instead of spending the 2 blank face dice like I did, I could have spent this die right here, which actually has a booster on it, to ignore 1 risk. So instead, I'm going to go ahead, actually, you know what? Let's not do it. We'll go ahead and actually not use it for right now because I do kind of want to show you what happens when you have to roll a risk die, and we'll be a little smarter as we go forward. Of course, I'll probably need these dice for other reasons in just a moment anyway. So I paid my 2 blank white dice inside the action track now to do the climb. Again, if I was min-maxing things and trying to do things the best and most efficient way possible, I would absolutely use the white die with the ignoring of 1 risk boost on it in order to not even have to roll this risk die. But I'm going to do this because I want to show you guys what the risk die is all about. So let's go ahead and roll 1 of them, thanks to having 1 risk, and see what we get. We got ourselves a bolt. So risk overall can be pretty nasty because the more risk you have, the more risk dice you're rolling. So you want to keep that low or mitigate it to a lower level. In this case, the bolt here tells us we're going to get fatigue. So we're going to move one action die from your action track to the fatigue slot. So as of right now, this is the tempo die. So I cannot fatigue this die, but I can fatigue either one of these. So I'll choose this white die and bring it down here. Now, if I happen to roll this one on the risk die, this is a spawn. You immediately spawn one biter if it's daytime, or viral if it's nighttime, in the area you moved into, or in the area you are in if the risk was caused by a utility action. You might be wondering, well, what's a utility action? That's if you choose to interact with something or use something. This one's very straightforward. You take a wound card, and when you take a wound card, you'll take a card off the top of the deck, and you're going to have it face down. When you take another wound, you'll flip it face up, and that's when the effect on the wound card is going to come into play and really start hounding you. And of course, if you have 4 face-up wound cards, by the end of it, your character is gone. A blank means nothing happens. It is the best possible result. And the final result here is this one, and it's an exposure. You take one exposure token, you place it next to the top of your exposure deck, which is this one right here. It's going to make your life a little bit more troublesome later on. Long story short, that token is going to remind you when you're drawing exposure cards in the future to draw an additional one. And if you have to gain another exposure token when you already have one, you're going to trigger what's known as chase, and it's not something you're going to like. I'm inside of a zone with a loot bag. I can choose as an action to interact with it, and if I do, I don't have to spend any action dice to take this. The only thing I have to do is take a look in the area that the loot bag is in, and if there's any enemies, I have to roll a risk die for each one. Let's go ahead and roll the die and see how we do. We got ourselves, a spawn. That is not good. Unfortunately, as an interact action is a utility action, that means the biter that's being spawned is spawning right into the same zone that I am. I've taken the loot bag token, and it's worth mentioning you're going to place this next to your character because you can actually use it as crafting material in between scenarios. Now, that won't matter for the prototype, but in the full version, it will. I found myself a stamina booster. This one says return one die from your character board to your ready pool. Sounds very, very useful in the right situations. I'm going to place this item card for now next to my dashboard on the right-hand side. I'll choose when I want to use it. It does have a keyword quick, and what that means is that when I use this and consume it, it is a risk-free usage, which is awesome. It means I don't ever have to roll risk dice for it, don't have to worry about it. There are some items you're going to find that will have the keyword focus, and that means that that particular card, when it's consumed or used, you will actually roll risk dice equal to the number of enemies in your area. I'm going to go ahead and use one of my action dice in order to do an attack against the enemy that showed up in my zone. I'm going to use this one right here. I'm going to keep this one because it has this nice defensive boost on it. I'll keep this one unused so when we go into what might happen later on with the enemies to kind of help me in defense. Now, this one here I'll go ahead and place on my board. We're also going to gain the momentum die as we're filling in the 4th spot on the track. So I'm using the die to pay for the action of attacking. Worth mentioning that the boost that's on there to ignore one risk won't matter here when you're doing an attack. You're just going ahead and making an attack. So that's going to put me at the 4th position here, which means now we get the momentum die. It goes into this slot, and in a future round, I'll have this to roll. If you happen to be using a ranged weapon, it will specify the range you can use it from. In this case, we're going to go ahead and grab 2 damage dice. So I've got them right here because we are doing the chop suey, and let's see how much we can get. We're picking this target here. We still have to select our target in the area, and we're going to make our roll. We got ourselves a 6, although this 5 was just off to the side, but that is more than enough to get past the biter because every biter has a health of 4. Now, unfortunately, after reading Cleave, it states that you're only taking the additional damage you didn't use and putting it towards another enemy in the area. So unfortunately, if 4 was used up by one enemy, I only have 2 remaining, and that is not enough to take out this other enemy. And unlike other games where you're tracking health, it's all or nothing. So you need to actually hit to its health value to take it out completely, or nothing at all happens. Now, the only question I have in my mind is, should I go all out and use my final die to try to take this individual out? If I do, let me tell you the odds of what's on this damage die. We have a 4, that would do it, so that's 1. This 1 would do nothing. This 3 would do nothing. The 2 would do nothing, so that's 3 sides doing nothing. The 4, 5, and the critical hit would all take this individual out, as the critical hit, of course, allows you to take out a viral or a biter. Now, it's a 50-50 shot here. It might be worth it to clear it out so it's not inside the same area here, but then I'm burning all my dice. But let's go ahead and do it anyway. So I'm going to go ahead and actually use this one. We'll place it in the action track. We're going to roll this die right now, and we're going to see if we can pull it off. And I'm not going to go ahead and exhaust anything further in order to bump this up to a stronger attack with this weapon because, well, I don't have any more fatigue slots to use. So we're going to go ahead and roll it off, and we got it. So this guy has been taken out. With everything dealt with behind him, he's going to continue to make his way around the corner here to get to that number 1 token, which is one of the 2 switches we need to flip to get the gate open. And that is a full character turn. Of course, it's going to be much quicker without the explanations involved when we head into Rowan's turn. Rowan's activating next. Let's go ahead and roll the dice and see what we get. Prescott is going to be heading towards the switch over here. I'm going to have Rowan head over here. Again, remember, I cannot jump or climb over any fences as they're all live right now, but I can certainly scale a building and try and jump over. That might not be a bad idea. There's a spawn zone in the center here, and this area is divided by a dashed line, so this is all one area. There's 2 biters in that area. Let's just try to avoid a confrontation as much as we can for now and try to get this gate over here open. So what I'm going to do is going to do some climbing. If I want to climb, I got to use a die to climb, an additional one for every level. So this is 1 level up, so it'll cost me 2 dice in order to pull it off, as I don't have any bonuses to make that cheaper at the moment. We'll place these in the action row. During the climb, we don't have to worry about any risk rolls because there was no enemies in the space that we just left. So now let's talk about jumping, because we're going to jump over here. We've done this already, but this time I'm going to do it more efficiently with her. I'm going to have her jump, and this right here gives a boost. It says jump with 1 less die. So instead of having to jump and spend 2, it'll only be 1. She makes the jump no problem. On the risk side of the equation, she always gets a base 1 when you make a jump, and then an additional 1 for every enemy in the area you left, but there was none. So we just have 1 to roll for here. Let's see what happens with the risk die. We roll it. We got ourselves this symbol. And we know that symbol very well. That's the fatigue symbol. So we'll bring a die down. I'll choose this one. I'm going to have Rowan go ahead and spend a die here. We're going to use this one here in order to move. We're going to move down. So we're going to go into this space down below. And when we do, this is a really cool boost. This one allows you to push the target to an adjacent area before or after the action. I'm going to choose to do it after, as I've already jumped down, and I, of course, need to be in the same space. Now I'm going to go ahead and shove this individual into a different area. I'm going to push it over here, and that's going to clear the way for me. It's also worth mentioning that off screen, that was my 4th die in the action track, and so I get the momentum die in the momentum slot on the dashboard for Rowan, which I'm doing right now, which is awesome. So later on, I'll be able to gain that die. So both my characters will have that going into the next round. And I have 1 more die here I could spend if I want, or I could leave it, but I think I will spend it to actually get further away and towards the switch. So let's go ahead and use it for a move. We're going to move into this location here. And then an interact doesn't cost a die, so we're going to go ahead and interact with this and flip it. I'd say overall that was a really productive turn and sets us up really well for the next round to be able to get this gate open. So as you can see, the player turn moves very quickly, especially when there's no explanations like there was for Prescott. As you guys have a better understanding of how things flow, we're picking up the pace as we go along. That wraps up the very first phase of the round. That's the activation phase all done. We now move to the exposure phase. Within this phase, we're going to go ahead and find out the exposure value for each of the characters in play. And we're going to do this first by taking a look at the action track, and based on the number of actions that were done, there is an associated number above to let you know what the exposure value is from the action track based on how many actions we chose to do. So if you don't do as many, your exposure value won't be as high. In this case, I was pretty aggressive, so we got up to 3 here on the track for Prescott. Now you remember before when I talked about potentially getting exposure tokens that we placed right here in the exposure deck. So if you have an exposure token there, that can give you an additional one on top of what you had from the track. And of course you might run into other game effects or different abilities that might push this up, but for right now it's 3. The exposure value for Rowan, it will be the exact same thing. She had the same number of actions that she used, so she got up to 3 on the action track, but she has no tokens on top of her exposure deck, and there's no other game effects that are adding anything to the equation, so both of our runners have the same value. So it is worth mentioning that if you happen to have 2 runners in the same space, their exposure values will actually add together in terms of determining who goes first. And who goes first is a good question here because we have 2 runners with the same exposure value, 3 each, so which one do you resolve? You get to pick. Rowan will start things off. I just simply go ahead and draw 3 exposure cards based on the 3 exposure value. And you'll see the top half of the card is for day, the bottom half is for night. We know we're in the daytime. We take a look at the icons. We see a lot of movement icons. You just total these up. So we have a total of 3 movement. Now, just for context on this one, there are other icons you can potentially find on these cards. You're going to find spawn icons. They tie into spreading. That's a game mechanism that's very important. I'll show you that later on when it actually happens. Movement icons, you can see them here. We got 3 of them. I'll show you exactly how they work. And then after the movement is done, if enemies are in your area, all the enemies in your area will attack you. So we have 3 movement from our exposure cards. We take a look at the area that our character is currently in and what's adjacent to it. The only thing adjacent to it is going to be this spawn zone area right here, which is not great because we have 3 movement. It is the only zone that can actually pull enemies. And so all 3 that are sitting inside of here are all coming into the same area. Now, this example was very easy because I have one area here and only one other area that's adjacent, so all of the enemies to make up the 3 movement came from this center area in. Very straightforward, very easy to do. But if you happen to be in the center of the game board, for instance, and say there were multiple types of enemies surrounding you, the way in which this resolves is quite interesting, and I'll talk more about that when we actually hit it later on. Now, the first thing you do when you know enemies are coming after you is you can use a defend action, if you happen to have any dice, that is. And I don't, because both my characters pushed themselves so far in terms of what they tried to accomplish, I didn't leave any dice for defense, which is going to come back to bite me, actually. So we can see here, Rowan here's in the corner. We have 3 of these enemies coming at me, and I have no defensive actions I can pull off right now. However, as you can see in the top left-hand corner of her dashboard, she does have a jacket with a defensive value on it, and I can turn that over to damage her jacket in order to give me 1 defense. So I get 1 defense for the jacket. Also worth mentioning, the perfect dodge there on the far left says, while defending, evasion boosters are worth +1 defense. So let's say I actually had a die to do a defensive action. If I did that, not only would I get the defensive action, but if I had an evasion booster on it, I get a +1 to my defense. So something to keep in mind with her. Now we total up the attack value, and we know we got biters, and we got 3 of them, so 3. Next, we grab a single damage die and roll it. If the number on the die is equal or lower than the number of attacking infected, then you add 1 to the attack value of the infected. So in this case, this die is equal or lower than the number of the attacking infected. There was 3. This is a 1. So we're going to add 1 to the attack value. So now they have a total of 4. If the result is greater than the number of attacking effective, you don't add anything. And on a crit result, you actually add 2 to the attack value of the infected at night. You do not add anything if it's the daytime. So 4 is the attack value, 1 defense, so 3 wounds coming through to me. The very first one gets given to me face down. The second one is a face up. You just flip the one that you just placed face down. And when you take 2 or more wounds, you're going to lose your momentum die. So this die is going to be taken away. And then it states here, adrenaline, push 1 infected from your area. So I'll be doing that in a moment for sure. And then the third wound is going to be face down right here. And as I mentioned before, you lose the game when your character has 4 face up wound cards. So Rowan is very overwhelmed in the corner, but she's able to push 1 away. That's going to do it for the exposure cards for Rowan. Let's move on to Prescott. Exposure value for Prescott is 3, so 3 cards drawn. We got a spawn and 3 movement. We total up our spawn icons. We have 1. During the day, we place biters. During the night, virals. That resolves a spawn icon, but we have 3 movement to resolve for Prescott. Prescott is in this area here. The only area adjacent to him where enemies can come in is this area with 2, so both of them are moving in. The third point of movement is lost as no other enemy can use it. I've done a similar thing that I did with Rowan. I've spent my jacket by flipping it over to give myself 1 defense. Let's go ahead and make a roll here and see how it goes. The die result is equal to or less than the number of affected that are attacking me, so +1, so a total of 3 attack value versus my 1 defense, so 2 wounds coming to me. So the first wound I get is face down. It's known as a light wound when it's face down. It turns into a heavy wound when it flips over. For the second wound, we'll find out what it says. It says bad blood. Immediately make a fast attack for free. That actually sounds pretty good. So you get wounded so much, you actually get angry enough to do something back. We'll do that in a second. The other thing that happens if you get 2 or more wounds, again, we lose the momentum die. So from both characters getting hit so much during this round, we're going to lose the die. You even lose the die if it's the last die in your action track. and it's being used as the tempo die. So if this die happened to be here, for instance, in a future round, you'd still lose it. So in this case, it was here. We haven't even gotten a chance to use it yet, but it's taken away from us because we took 2 or more wounds. The Bad Blood wound card told us to make a fast attack. You'll see it here. It tells us to roll 1 damage die. Let's see how we do. Hopefully we get a pretty good result on this so we can thin the amount of enemies in our area. We got ourselves a 1. That is not going to be enough to take anybody out. The exposure phase is now complete. The cards we just used for both characters are placed in discard piles underneath of their exposure decks. This was certainly a rough exposure phase for the 2 runners I'm controlling. Going forward, I'm going to be making more optimal decisions with their movement and where they end up, trying to do my best to keep wounds to a minimum. I wanted to be able to show you guys combat and wounds happening very early on, so now that we got that out of the way, we can really start moving. We now head into the third and final phase, the end phase. The first thing we check for is any infected which have been knocked over. That has not happened yet. We'll talk more about it when it does, but currently at this point, they would stand back up. Next, all the runners who have a momentum die on their player area check their action track. If the tempo value is 4 or more, they get to keep their momentum die. Otherwise, it's returned to the game supply. In our case, we lost both of our dice in advance due to taking 2 or more wounds. We now increase the round track by 1, and you'll see we're moving from day to night as we're going from a light space to a dark space. And also, if there happens to be an event token, a green, blue, or red one in the space you move into, you're going to trigger an event. In this case, they're not part of the equation yet, but maybe later on. When the round marker goes from 7 to 8 and we transition into night, we need to do a couple things. The first thing is take all the exposure cards we've already used in our discard pile and shuffle them back into our exposure deck. Once the decks are all shuffled up, rotate them 180 degrees so that the night half is at the very top. During round number 7, in the daytime, we only had biters to deal with. During the nighttime, moving into round number 8, all the infected cards in the row are going to flip over. And as most of you will remember from the video game, Dying Light becomes extremely dangerous during the nighttime as we have a number of infected to deal with across varying types. I've placed miniatures next to each card to give you an idea as to which one ties to which color. Something else to take note of, which is going to happen during the night phase, is night activations. These are shown on the bottom of the cards. We'll talk more about them when they actually trigger. And of course, that's going to tie into a brand new change you're going to see during the exposure phase. We're going to be following a nighttime procedure rather than a daytime one. Next, we're going to spawn 1 howler in each of the nests on the game board. They are represented by these tokens right here. They're typically in the center or close to the center of each of the game tiles, although some of them are off center quite a bit. It's also worth mentioning that this can actually vary in terms of what is spawned here per scenario. That's going to do it for the game board. We're now going to go to the activation deck and make sure it's set up correctly. If you watched the how to set up video, you'll remember we set up this activation deck, which is only used during the nighttime. 1 card in here is for the infected. The other 2, in this case, are for the 2 characters I'm controlling. If you happen to be controlling more characters, you'll be placing their activation cards inside this deck as well. Shuffle them up, place them face down. And now you've seen an entire round of play inside of Dying Light, the board game. At this point, we've covered the activation phase, we've covered the exposure phase, and the end phase. That concludes the first round. We head into the second round. It is round number 8. And at this point, activation begins. This time, instead of being able to choose the characters that you want to activate based on it being daytime, we're instead using the activation deck, and we flip it over, and it tells us who's activating. I'm sure no one's forgotten the situation that Rowan has herself in right now. Although she was able to complete one of the objectives by flipping the switch, she's got herself log jammed in a corner with a number of affected bearing down on her. Let's go ahead and get her dice pool ready. So we're going to go ahead and gather our dice. We look at the action track and we take all the dice out of that track. So we're going to get all of these to roll. The one that's sitting here is going to move from the fatigue area into the cooldown area. So we don't get this die yet to roll as part of the pool. And we also don't have the momentum die. Unfortunately, it would have actually come into our pool if it had sat here. But instead, because it was lost for wounds in the prior round, it's going to sit out. And we're going to have to work our way back up to getting 4 action dice in the track in order to gain that die back in this slot for a future round. This time around for Rowan, we only have 4 dice instead of the 5 we had last round. And you're going to find out very quickly that dice management is going to be a huge aspect of controlling your character, but it's a lot of fun and it doesn't bog down the gameplay. It's actually very interesting and leads to a lot of strategic decisions as to whether or not you should be pushing for momentum dice to offset having dice that are still cooling down from being fatigued. You have the choice to fatigue your dice at times in order to power up your attacks and do other game effects, but the game will also tell you to fatigue your dice at times when you don't want to. So you're balancing all of this, and of course you always have the ability to hold dice for defensive purposes, which we did not do at all in round number 1, and you can see how valuable that can be. Let's go ahead and roll the dice for Rowan and see what she gets. In terms of boosters on the dice, she did extremely well. We got lots to work with here. Rowan's going to decide to do an attack. She's going to spend 1 action die to do the attack and a 2nd action die to power it up. Her cricket stick is going to be used, and that gives her the ability to knock down one of these 2, and hopefully we can kill one, knock down the other. We'll see how it goes. These boosters are not going to help in this case, but these go on her track. Let's make that attack. We're going to spend 1 action die to do the attack. The boost here is not going to apply whatsoever, so we're going to spend this by placing it on the action track for Rowan, and we're going to immediately fatigue it so that we're not just doing a fast attack, we're doing a crickety crack, which allows us to knock down one enemy. I'm again trying to aim here to do something to both. Let's go ahead and roll the damage die and see how we do. We're looking for a 4 or higher, or even a critical would be nice. We got a 3, so that is not going to do it. We're not going to be able to take one out, but we can certainly knock one over. Now, based on how that went, what I'm going to choose to do next is use this die here, and that symbol allows me to push a target to an adjacent area before or after I do an action. So I'm going to choose to push before I do an action. We're going to shove the infected that is standing up, the biter, into another area. With the boost resolved and the infected shoved into this area here, I'm going to go ahead and use the actual die itself for movement. I'm going to move into the zone, which was right next to me as I tried to climb up. It's getting pretty wild down in this area here, so I certainly don't want to be on ground level with these guys, and I can get away from the biters and also from the howler, as they do not have the ability to climb up on things, and you know whether they do on their actual infected cards. They will have a blue icon, which shows an individual almost jumping or climbing on it. So the only ones that actually can climb up are virals or volatiles. So in this case, it's safe to be up on higher levels, so let's go ahead and do a climb. The cost of climbing is 1 die to do it, and 1 die for every level you're going up, so it's going to be 2 dice I need to spend. These boosters are not going to help me in this situation whatsoever. This one is for jumping, and this one will reduce risk, which would actually be a good thing to have if this enemy was standing up and I was jumping out of that area. Then this enemy would contribute 1 risk, and this boost would actually negate it, but because we have this thing knocked over, we don't have to worry about it anyway. That's going to do it for Rowan's turn. Let's go to the activation deck and find out which card is coming off the top. We got ourselves, oh no, the Infected. As we pulled the Infected activation card, we're going to be activating nighttime abilities across all of the enemies in play. Also, it's a good idea to place these cards in nighttime activation order. It's going to always start with the special infected, which for this scenario is howlers. Then it's going to be volatiles after that, virals, and biters last. Now we have 4 howlers on the game board. Remember, we spawned those in each one of the nests, and so this one states in range 1 for each zone with a runner, spawn 1 viral. The night activation says in range 1 for each zone with a runner, you spawn a viral, and it's all based on this howler right here. So range 1 away is going to be this runner here, but not this one here. Even though the areas do touch right along this line, there is a wall, so this is not going to get any kind of benefit from seeing anything here, but it absolutely can see this individual. It's going to start howling, and then it's going to bring in a viral. Thanks to the howler making a lot of noise, the viral comes running into the nest. There are 3 other howlers on the game board, but they're not within range 1 of the runners. So we can move on to the volatile, which we don't have any of, so we'll continue on down the row, and we have a viral now. So we'll go ahead and activate it. It says, if no runners are present in range 1, move 1 toward the closest one. There is a runner within range 1, so this viral is not moving. Last but not least, we have the biters. Their nighttime activation is to spread the biters in the most crowded area. Now this spread is very specific to biters, and the most crowded area is of course the nest right here in this situation. We have 3 biters inside of it. You're going to pick one of the empty adjacent areas beside this one, and you're going to move a biter into it. Then you're going to go clockwise around and continue putting biters into empty spaces. So I chose to start with this space right here. We placed 1 in there, then we went around over to here, placed 1 here, and then here. Obviously there is 1 inside of this area, but it's knocked over. And this right here is fire, and I'm going to assume they're not going to push themselves into an area that actually reduces their overall toughness. They're going to try to avoid that. And a reminder again that biters cannot climb, so they're going to stay on ground level as they do not have the blue icon on their infected card. That'll do it for the infected activation. Let's go to the next card, which we know will be Prescott. Now, Prescott's going to have even less dice going into this round because 2 of them are fatigued. He's going to have these 3 to roll. He doesn't have the momentum die in the slot because he took too many wounds, and so he lost it previously. And then the 2 that are sitting here in the fatigued area are going to move to the cooldown for future use, but are stuck there for now. We're rolling 3 dice to see what we get for Prescott, and we have these 3. This roll is actually great for Prescott based on him having 2 infected in his area. He can use this die for an attack and use the boost on it to ignore having to fatigue a die from his action track. So this die will go into his action track for taking an attack, and then I normally have to fatigue it in order to go for the chop suey here, but because of this boost, I get it without having to fatigue the die, which is fantastic. So we're rolling 2 damage dice, and we have the ability to cleave as well. I've got my 2 damage dice, and here's hoping things pan out for me. Let's see how we do. We got a 4 and a 1. Well, 5 total. The one that goes across is not going to be enough, but we take out one of them. I'm going to go ahead and use this die right here in order to do another attack. We're going to do the fast attack this time using only 1 damage die and hoping to get what we need to clear this individual out. We got ourselves a 2, and that's not going to do it. You know what? I want this thing to work out well. Let's do another attack here, and I'm going to fatigue this die in the row in order to roll 2 dice this time around, because I really want to make sure I take this individual out and keep myself safe. So here we go. That is more than enough. Wish we had gotten that the first time around. A 4 and a 3. Pretty decent. That is way more enough to take out that infected. And it's worth mentioning the 4 and 3 that I just rolled wouldn't have actually given me a better outcome the first time around, so I kind of slipped when I stated that. Another thing I want to mention is instead of actually fatiguing the blue die, I'd rather fatigue the white die that I had in my action track. So I'm bringing that down in order to do that chop suey I did at the very end there. It's also worth mentioning that both characters were not able to get to the 4th slot on their action track, so no momentum die being placed in either one of these positions. We now move into the exposure phase, where we check our exposure for each area that we're in, and also based on the actions we took. You can see here, I'm still currently at 1 exposure off the board this time because we didn't tick into the 4th position, and same with Rowan. So our exposure values are 1. We only got 1 from our dashboards each, and we also have no exposure tokens on the exposure decks, and no other game effects are adding anything into the equation. So we're drawing 1 exposure card each, and we've got 1 here with a spawn and a movement for Rowan, and this one we get a pass on. We'll deal with the spawn icon first. This runner's closest to this nest right here, and during the nighttime, a viral is going to show up. If it was during the daytime, it would be a biter. And the number of infected that are spawned in is all based on the number of symbols. So we only got 1 spawn symbol, so 1 viral coming in. Now we have to deal with movement. We have 1 movement icon to resolve for Rowan, and all we do is take a look at adjacent areas, and 1 enemy is going to move into the same space as Rowan right now. And we determine this by first checking if there's any volatiles, which there currently aren't any. We then know that there are virals. They're next in order. We have 2 of them, but we only have 1 movement icon, so only 1 of them is going to come jumping up with us. As I mentioned before, volatiles and virals are the only ones that can get up onto the same level as us. Now let's talk about the defense side of the equation. I don't have any unused dice that I can use to prop up my defense, but I could use the jacket that Rowan has. As you'll remember earlier, I've already gone ahead and flipped it once in a prior situation to get a defense boost. At this point, this thing is damaged, and I can go ahead if I want and remove it completely from my dashboard. As you can see, it has a defensive icon in the bottom right there in order to gain 1 defense, which I might actually do to try to stop as much wounds coming through to me as possible. But I do want to talk about this token in general and how you should actually think about it strategically. So when you first start the game, you're going to have this thing available to you along with other types of equipment, and in the bottom right hand corner you'll have an icon, in the bottom left hand corner you have an icon. The one in the bottom right is the one that you can use if you flip it over to damage it and then use it again to take it away to gain, in this case, defense. The icon in the bottom left is actually tied to the momentum die, and it ends up being a passive ability that if you do not use this token to damage it to gain defense on the bottom right hand side, you can actually keep this passive boost all the time throughout the entire game. So it's a trade-off. Do you basically keep things in a good state with your equipment to get the passive bonuses when you roll the momentum die and to be able to use those boosts as you go through? And I haven't had a time frame to show you that yet because I haven't actually gained the momentum die yet, but it can be very, very handy. Or do you use this equipment mainly to mitigate nasty situations? You have to make that decision as you go through. For me, I'm going to take my damage jacket and I'm going to toss it completely to gain the 1 defense because I really want to avoid getting more wounds as much as possible on Rowan. I still have to roll a damage die here, which could change the outcome of things, but as of right now, at least I'm blocking the attack value from this individual, which is already a 1. We'll see what the die does to us. We got ourselves a 5. If the number on the die happens to be equal or lower than the number of affected attacking you, then you're going to add +1. You actually saw this happen in a prior combat, but this time it's a 5, and we've only got 1 infected, so it's higher, which means nothing happens, which is great for me because 1 attack value is all that's coming through, and my defense from chucking that jacket away is going to negate all of it. Now, if a critical gets rolled on this and it's nighttime, it's really bad. You get a +2 on the attack value. That's going to do it for the exposure phase. We came out unscathed, and also Prescott got a complete pass with a good night card, so nothing there. We enter the end phase. All knocked down infected are going to stand back up. Now there's a basic check here for all runners who have the momentum die in their player area. They check their action track, and if their tempo is 4 or more, they get to keep it. In this case, we still haven't gained the momentum die. We're hoping to do that in the future. The round marker moves from 8 to 9, and if there's any events, we resolve them, but there isn't. We shuffle all the activation cards in the deck, and we're going to draw the top one to start off the brand new round in the activation phase, and we have the infected going first. Let's move through the nighttime activations here across the infected cards. We have in range 1 for each zone with a runner spawn a viral, so we have another viral landing in the nest. Thankfully, there are no volatiles in play, so nothing to do here. Moving on to the virals, if no runners are present in range 1, you move one towards the closest one. In this case, all the virals are easily within range 1 of a runner, so they're not going anywhere. Biters are next. They're going to spread based on the most crowded area. This infected activation works out really well for us because not much ends up happening. Really, we just got 1 viral in the nest, and the biters are not going to spread any further from the most crowded area, which is this one right here, because there are none inside of it, and everybody else is in single positions elsewhere. The next card off the top of the activation deck is Rowan, so we'll go ahead and gather all dice from the action track. We're also going to take the ones from the cooldown position, and this one is going to go from fatigue to cooldown. Rowan has 4 dice going into this roll. Let's see how we do for the boosters. On top of the dice, we got these ones. This works out pretty good. I'm going to have her go ahead and make a melee attack against this viral. Virals are 5 health rather than the biters, which are 4. So we're going to go ahead and use this die here for an attack. We get the benefit of a boost here to ignore the fatigue cost to go to the crickety crack, which can certainly help us. We can at least knock this enemy over if we don't get enough damage to take it out. We're going to roll 1 damage die. Let's go ahead and see how this pans out. I'm hoping for good things here. Let's see if we can pull it off. We got ourselves a 5. That is exactly what we needed. Rowan's going to move from where she is down here, and she's going to spend this 1 blank die to do it. I'm going to have her stop right there. She's going to keep these 2 dice in her unused pool, hopefully for defense if we need it. That'll do it for her turn. She's being a bit more reserved this time around and also trying to protect herself from additional wounds. And we're going to now go to Prescott, as the last activation card has to be Prescott. Prescott's taking all his dice in his action track as well as the cooldown area, and he's also going to move over his fatigue die to the cooldown. Let's roll our 4 dice and see how we do. We need Prescott to get around the corner here to that switch as quick as possible and hopefully keep himself protected while he does it. He got himself some decent boosts. He's going to use 1 die to move. Next, he's going to go ahead and use this die here to move into the space with the switch, and then after moving, he's going to push that biter out of there. He's pushed the biter into the area with fire, which is reducing its toughness while it's in there, which is great. He's now going to interact with this switch, and that is going to trigger this scenario card. As it states right here on the bottom, once a runner interacts with the last switch, remove the gate and reveal card S2. The fence no longer has movement restrictions, so we can climb over, jump over it. We're now going to open up the gate. Inside the prototype, it just looks like a wall, but it'll actually be a gate in the final version. We'll remove this now. The gate opens up in front of Rowan, providing her a way out. The next card is called Give and Take. It says the radio perks up. Setting up that perimeter took us over a month, just so you know. Anyway, night's coming and you're not exactly out of the woods yet. A buddy of mine's got a safe house nearby with a UV source, 2-story condo northeast of the junkyard. I'm sure you're itching to get a suntan, but I scratched your back already, so you owe me. I've got a stash in a marked vent on the roof of a Chinese joint to the northwest. Emergency type. Take all you want. It'll sure come in handy. Just bring along a small black box that there's with the other stuff. As soon as the conversation's over, your GRE keys light up. There are inhibitors nearby. Things we need to focus on is to claim the stash. We interact with token number 2, then we can reveal the card here to the left. Next, it says to get the inhibitors, you need to pick up the inhibitor card and reveal card S2B. And at the very bottom, once a runner moves onto the building with a 3 token, reveal card S3. The first two things are in the top left-hand corner here. We can interact with that token that states 2 on it to get the stash and reveal card S2A. We can also pick up the inhibitor there. If we do it, we take the inhibitor's card that we placed off to the side during setup, and we reveal card S2B. So after we've headed to this top left location, interacted with those tokens, we can head over to the far right. You'll see that very tall building with a 3 on the very top. That's where we need to get to progress the story further. We return back to Prescott's turn. He still has 2 dice remaining if I choose to use them, and I certainly know that the exposure phase is coming up, and being this close to all of these infected is probably not the best idea. So rather than try to push ahead, I'm actually going to take a step back and use a white die to move. I'm going to stop right there. I'll keep this die for defense if needed, but my main objective here is to stay at least 2 spaces away from this area right here with the nest and the howler, and of course these wonderful virals. Actually, change of plans here. I just realized that this is all one giant area, so if they move into here, they can still come at me. So let's use that final die. Instead of keeping it for defense, we're going to shuffle ourselves back here. The other advantage to doing this is we've hit our 4th action slot, so we get the momentum die placed in this slot. We now head into the exposure phase. We don't have any exposure tokens on our decks yet. We don't have any other game effects pushing that, but we do have the action track, and we have a 2 here for Prescott, whereas we just have a 1 for Rowan. I pulled the cards for each character, and we'll start here with Prescott as he has the highest exposure value. You can see we got virals activating in range 2. We have movement icons, spawn, and another movement. We'll start off by spawning. We spawn in the closest nest, and that is going to still be this location right here. It will be another viral. So we now have 3 virals in this nest location. It's worth mentioning when you go to place the 7th infected in an area, you're going to stop your spawning and you're going to do some spreading and then go back to spawning afterwards. That's not going to happen right now, but there will be times when you have a lot of infected in one area and they will spread. Now let's deal with enemy movement, and normally you're going to look at all adjacent areas from where you currently are, so it'd be like here, here for instance, up here, nothing on this side because this wall blocks that, but basically everybody that is going to be a problem for me is up to 2 areas away. But the card, the exposure card we pulled said virals are going to activate in range 2, which means we will actually have these 3 virals moving because we have 3 points of movement to do, even though they are range 2 away. Now, when you get into a situation where the virals could potentially move to multiple different locations based on moving through areas and the fact that they can actually climb up on top of buildings, the virals could come this way, 1, they could come up here, 1, or they could go around the corner. When you have multiple different ones you can resolve, you get to decide where they're placed. I'm going based on the prototype rules as written, so I get a choice when there are multiple options, as I mentioned, so all of these virals are headed towards me. The good news is none of them are in my area, so none of them are going to attack me. Now let's resolve Rowan's card. She only had a single exposure card. It had a spawn on it and 1 movement. So a viral ends up in the nest, and we have 1 movement to use. The first one we look for is any volatiles. We don't have them. Virals are next, and this viral that is over here is too far away to be activated as it doesn't have the range 2 on the card like we did for Prescott. It's only range 1, so nothing will happen there, but we do have a biter that is within range 1, so that biter's heading in. Now, I purposely kept 2 unused dice for Rowan, so I'm going to use both of them to give me a point of defense each, which should be very helpful. The attack value of the viral is a 1 already. We're going to roll 1 damage die and see what else happens. Hopefully not a crit. All right, we got ourselves a 1. And we're very lucky because we had these 2 dice and we used them both for defense. We get 2 defense, we get 1 attack value from the infected, and an additional 1 because this value either is equal to or lower than the number of affected attacking me. So 2 attack value coming at me, 2 defense, nothing happens. And guess what? Because I used 2 unused dice and placed them in the action track, that got me to the 4th slot, which means the momentum die is going to come into play here for Rowan in the future, which is great. And something that is absolutely worth mentioning about Rowan is she is very powerful when you use dice that have the evasion boost on it, because the evasion boost ends up becoming a +1 defense. So when I said I had 2 defense, with the 2 dice that I chose to use, which were these 2, based on her skill card, it says when defending, evasion boosters are worth +1. That means she actually had 4 defense on that last attack, which is incredibly high. If you look at that prior clip, at the bottom of the skill card in orange, it states at the end of the exposure phase, you can shift 1 in your area. What that means is she's able to do a dodge during her defense that allows her to shift within the area she's in. However, she is currently inside of an area that is not broken into zones, so she can't shift within this area anyway. But if she happened to be, let's say hypothetically here in this area, she could shift across the dotted line. We are now in the end phase. Any knocked over, infected, or stood back up? We don't have any. Now we check all runners who have a momentum die in their player area. We check their action track. If their tempo value is 4 or more, they get to keep it. Both of our characters are at 4 or more, so we're good there. And then we advance the round marker. The round marker is going to move from 9 to 10, and also I've shuffled the activation deck, and we'll draw this going into the next round. And that, my friends, wraps up part number 1 for Dying Light, the board game from Glass Cannon Unplugged. This part number 1 was very much an instructional video to get you through a handful of rounds to show you how the game flows and operates. As we continue into the gameplay, there will be far less explanations. As we dig in, I'm going to be trying my best to make as much progress as possible. Now that you understand the nuances of the game, there'll still be some small things here and there that we're going to run into that we haven't seen yet. But at this point, you have a great understanding as to how this thing is going to move. And also the campaign coming in the very near future will provide more information. If you have any questions whatsoever, let me know in the comments down below. Also, let me know what you thought of what you've seen so far, whether you're excited, whether you're not excited. I want to hear all of it in the comments, and subscribe to the channel to be notified of future videos landing. Thank you guys so much, and as always, keep on rolling solo.